Commander Zathar's clawed feet clicked against the cold metal decking of Forward Base Delta 7 as he stepped off the transport vessel. The sound echoed through the bustling docking bay, mixing with the hum of alien voices and the mechanical whir of loading equipment. Ships from a dozen different species came and went through the massive bay doors, their hulls bearing the scars of 20 years of warfare against an enemy that knew no mercy. The Caleron officer paused at the edge of the platform, his four arms hanging loosely at his sides as he surveyed the scene before him. Delta 7 represented everything the Coalition stood for: unity among the stars, cooperation between species, the shared dream of survival against an enemy that threatened all life in the galaxy. But Zathar felt none of the pride he should have experienced. His blue-gray skin, marked with pale scars from plasma burns and the distinctive puckered wounds left by devourer bioacid, told the story of 2 decades spent watching civilizations die. His large black eyes, evolved for the dim light of his homeworld, had seen too much death in the bright fires of war. Zathar had fought in the Battle of Kepler's Gate, where 3 Coalition fleets had been reduced to scrap metal and floating corpses in the span of 6 hours. He had witnessed the fall of New Carthage, where 1 billion souls had been consumed by creatures that turned living beings into fuel for their war machine. He had watched the proud Zelani Collective lose half their fleet trying to hold the Outer Rim. The weight of those memories pressed down on him as he walked through the station's corridors. The walls were lined with tactical displays showing the current state of the war. Red dots marking devourer positions, blue dots representing Coalition forces, and far too much empty space between them. The red was spreading, had been spreading for years, and everyone knew it. The Coalition was losing, slowly but inevitably, ground down by an enemy that felt no fear, knew no fatigue, and existed only to consume and destroy. Zathar had requested assignment to Delta 7 because he needed a break from the front lines. At least, that's what he told his superiors. The truth was more complicated. After 20 years of fighting, he was beginning to understand that the Coalition's strategies weren't working. They were fighting a conventional war against an unconventional enemy, applying the rules of civilized warfare to creatures that had never heard of civilization. "Commander Zathar, I presume?" The voice made him turn. A short figure in an unfamiliar uniform approached, walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged wherever they happened to be. The being had only 2 arms and 2 legs, a bizarrely symmetrical arrangement that seemed almost primitive compared to the elegant complexity of Caleron anatomy. Its skin was a pale pink color, stretched over a frame that looked fragile by galactic standards. But it was the creature's expression that caught Thar's attention, a wide smile that revealed white teeth, combined with eyes that seemed to find everything around them mildly amusing. "I'm Captain Jake Morris, Human Liaison Officer," the being said, extending one hand towards Thar in what he recognized as a human greeting ritual. "Welcome to Delta 7. Hope you're ready for an interesting assignment." Thar studied the extended hand for a moment before reaching out with one of his own arms to touch it briefly. The human's grip was firm and surprisingly warm, with a confidence that seemed out of place for such a young species. Humans had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, barely long enough to understand the basic principles of interstellar warfare. Yet here one stood as if he owned the station. "Captain Morris," Thar replied, his voice carrying the formal cadence of military protocol. "I have been assigned to observe operations in the human sector. I understand your people have recently been deployed to active combat zones." Morris nodded and gestured for Thar to follow him through the station's corridors. As they walked, Thar noticed that the human moved with an easy familiarity through the maze of passages, greeting other personnel with casual waves and brief conversations. It was clear that despite their recent arrival, humans had integrated themselves into the station's operations with remarkable efficiency. "You picked an interesting time to join us," Morris said as they walked past a series of tactical displays. "My people just got assigned to the Nightmare Sector 3 days ago." Thar stopped walking so abruptly that a passing maintenance technician had to swerve to avoid him. the Nightmare Sector. The name alone was enough to make veteran commanders request transfers to rear echelon positions. It was where the Coalition sent ships that were too damaged for effective combat but too valuable to scrap. It was where commanders who had lost the confidence of high command were given meaningless assignments to keep them out of the way. It was where 3 full Coalition fleets had been destroyed in the past year, their wreckage joining the growing debris field that marked the boundary between Coalition space and the expanding Devourer Empire. "Your people were sent there?" Sthar asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. The Nightmare Sector wasn't just dangerous. It was a death sentence with military decorations. Morris's smile widened, revealing more of those white teeth. "Yep. High Command figured we could buy some time while the real fleets regroup. Pretty standard for the new guys, right? Last species in gets the worst assignments." The way Morris talked about his species being sent to die disturbed Sthar more than he cared to admit. There was no resignation in the human's voice, no fear or anger at being handed what amounted to a suicide mission. If anything, Morris seemed excited about the prospect, as if being sent to the most dangerous sector of the war was some kind of privilege, rather than a punishment. They entered a briefing room where other Coalition officers were gathered around a large holographic table. The blue light from the display cast strange shadows on their faces, making them look like spirits from some ancient Kalaran legend. General Krixt of the Vorthon Republic looked up as they entered, his insect-like features arranged in an expression of barely concealed irritation. His compound eyes glittered with the cold light of someone who had seen too many plans fail and too many allies die. "Ah, our Kalaran observer has arrived," Krixt clicked in his mechanical voice. The translation software rendered his words in galactic standard, but Zathar could hear the underlying harmonics of frustration and resignation. "Perhaps you can help us understand why High Command wants us to waste time monitoring a species that will be extinct by week's end." Admiral Fern of the Zelani Collective nodded her scaled head in agreement. Her species had lost more ships to the Devourers than any other Coalition member, and the loss showed in the way she carried herself, like someone who had been fighting a losing battle for so long that she could no longer remember what victory looked like. "The humans have been given outdated ships and minimal supplies," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality of her people's native language. "They lack the biological adaptations needed to survive Devourer bioweapons. It is simple mathematics. They cannot win, so they will die, and their deaths will accomplish nothing." Morris sat down at the table and activated a section of the holographic display. It showed the current positions of human forces in the Nightmare Sector, represented by blue dots, against a background of red that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Zafar expected to see the blue dots retreating toward Coalition space, falling back in the face of overwhelming enemy superiority. Instead, the human forces were advancing deeper into Devourer territory, moving with a purpose that defied all military logic. "Our boys have been busy," Morris said cheerfully, his tone suggesting that he was discussing a particularly successful hunting expedition rather than military operations in the galaxy's most dangerous sector. "Took out 3 Devourer patrol groups yesterday. Lost some good people, but we gave better than we got." General Krick's mandibles clicked in what Zathar recognized as disbelief. Among the Vorthon, that particular sound indicated that the speaker was either lying or insane. "Define lost some good people in numerical terms," Krixt demanded. Morris consulted his datapad with the casual efficiency of someone reading. "But we took down 6 Devourer biocruisers and maybe 15 smaller vessels. Could have been more, hard to tell when they explode." The room went quiet. Those numbers were impossible. Human ships were smaller and less advanced than Coalition vessels, which were already inferior to Devourer bioships. The mathematics didn't work. A single Devourer biocruiser was the equivalent of 3 Coalition heavy cruisers, and here Morris was claiming that his people had destroyed 6 of them while losing fewer ships than they had killed. How? Admiral Fern asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morris shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire futility of trying to explain the inexplicable. Humans are stubborn. When we decide to join a war, we decide to win it. Our boys don't know how to quit. Over the next hour, Morris walked them through battle reports and casualty lists that told a story that made no sense according to any military doctrine Jadar knew. Humans were winning battles they should lose, but at costs that would break any rational species. The numbers painted a picture of warfare that was less strategy and more controlled suicide. One report showed a human destroyer ramming a Devourer bioship 3 times its size. The human ship had been destroyed, but so had the enemy vessel. Another detailed human marines boarding a Devourer carrier and fighting hand-to-hand with creatures designed to eat sentient beings alive. They had died, all of them, but not before planting explosives that crippled the carrier and sent it drifting helplessly until Coalition forces could finish it off. This is not warfare, Crick said finally, his mechanical voice carrying a note of something that might have been awe or horror. This is mass suicide with extra steps. Morris laughed, and the sound sent chills down Jadar's spine. It was the laughter of someone who found genuine amusement in things that should have been horrifying. Maybe, Morris said, still chuckling, but it's working, isn't it? After the briefing, Jadar walked with Morris to the observation deck. Through the transparent aluminum windows, they could see the distant glow of battles raging in the Nightmare sector. The lights flickered and pulsed like dying stars, each flash representing ships being destroyed and lives being lost in quantities that defied comprehension. Captain Morris, Jadar said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. Do your people understand what they are fighting? Morris looked out at the distant lights, his expression becoming thoughtful for the first time since Jadar had met him. Sure, he said. Big scary bugs that want to eat everyone in the galaxy. Pretty straightforward, really. The Devourers are not simply aggressive, Jadar explained, falling back on the clinical language he had learned to use when discussing humanity's greatest enemy. They are a biological weapon created by an extinct species whose name has been lost to history. They were designed to consume all life, to turn living worlds into fuel for their continued expansion. They feel no fear, no pain, no mercy. They cannot be reasoned with or negotiated with. They exist only to kill and consume, and they will continue to do so until every living thing in the galaxy has been devoured. Morris nodded as if Thar had just described the weather. Sounds familiar, he said. Something in the human's tone made Zar look at him more closely. Morris's eyes had a hardness that reminded Zar of veteran soldiers he had known, beings who had seen so much death that they had developed an emotional armor to protect themselves from the horror of it all. But Morris was young, barely past what humans called adulthood. His species had only been aware of the Devourers for a few years, hardly long enough to develop the kind of psychological scarring that Zar recognized. Your species has faced such enemies before? Zar asked. Not exactly, Morris said, his voice carrying undertones that the translation software couldn't quite capture. But humans have been fighting wars for as long as we've existed. We've gotten pretty good at killing things that need killing. That night, Zar reviewed the human battle reports in his quarters. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. Humans fought in ways that violated every principle of military science he had learned during his decades of service. They wasted resources on emotional gestures, spending ammunition to recover the bodies of dead comrades when that ammunition could have been used to kill more enemies. They refused to retreat from hopeless positions, choosing to die rather than live to fight another day. They treated their own lives as expendable, trading them for enemy casualties at exchange rates that would bankrupt any sane military organization. but they were winning. Against all logic, against all probability, against the accumulated wisdom of 20 years of coalition warfare against the Devourers, the humans were achieving victory after victory in a sector where victory was supposed to be impossible. One report caught his attention and held it like a trap. A human outpost designated Firebase Charlie had been surrounded by Devourer forces for 6 hours. Standard coalition doctrine would have called for immediate evacuation or orbital bombardment to prevent the position from being overrun. Instead, the humans had requested more ammunition. When informed that the request was denied due to Devourer air superiority making supply runs impossible, the humans had responded by fashioning explosive devices from their base's power cores and detonating them in the middle of Devourer formations. 17 humans had died in the explosions, but they had taken nearly 300 Devourers with them. The tactical result was significant. The destruction of the Devourer force had prevented an attack on a coalition supply convoy that was carrying medical supplies to refugee camps. But what struck Star was the final line of the report. Human Commander Rodriguez's last transmission was, "Tell my mom I kept my promise. Nature of promise unknown." Star set down the datapad and looked out his small window at the stars. In all his years of warfare, he had seen species fight for survival, for territory, for resources, for the abstract concept of freedom. He had never seen a species fight the way humans did, with a combination of tactical skill and absolute disregard for their own welfare that defied every principle of evolutionary biology. Tomorrow he would request permission to visit the human battlefront. He needed to see for himself what these creatures were doing in the Nightmare Sector. Something told him that what he found there would change everything he thought he knew about war. As he prepared for sleep, Star couldn't shake the feeling that the Coalition had made a terrible mistake. They had sent humanity to fight monsters, expecting them to die quickly and quietly, buying time for more experienced species to develop effective strategies. Instead, they had unleashed something that might be more dangerous than the monsters themselves. 3 days later, Star received the transmission that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was reviewing supply reports in his quarters when his communication device began making sounds he had never heard before. The signal was coming from the human battlefront. But it was wrong somehow. Mixed with standard military communications, Star could hear what sounded like singing and screaming and laughter all at the same time, as if the humans had found something amusing in the midst of their war. "This is Human Fleet Command to all Coalition observers," came a voice through the static. The speaker sounded exhausted, but elated, like someone who had just completed a marathon and was already planning to run another one. "We've had a good day out here. Really good. If anyone wants to see what we've been up to, now would be the time." The transmission cut off, leaving Star staring at his communication device. He had heard celebration messages before, transmitted by victorious commanders who wanted to share their success with headquarters. But this felt different. This felt dangerous, like a predator calling to its prey. Against his better judgment and direct orders from General Krixt, Star made his way to the ship bay. He found Lieutenant Lisa Grant, a young human communications specialist preparing a small reconnaissance vessel for departure. She looked up as he approached, her expression carrying the same mixture of exhaustion and excitement he had heard in the transmission. "You heard it too?" she asked, her hands continuing to work on the ship's control panel with practiced efficiency. Zadar nodded. "Your people sound different than they did 3 days ago." Lisa paused in her work and looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her face. "War changes people fast," she said, "especially humans. You want to come see what my boys have been doing out there?" "That would violate my orders," Zadar said, though he was already moving toward the ship's passenger compartment. Lisa smiled. but it wasn't a happy expression. It was the smile of someone who had seen things that would give nightmares to civilian populations. Orders are for people who plan to survive long enough to get in trouble for breaking them. An hour later, their small ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the nightmare sector. What Zadar saw made him question everything he thought he understood about the laws of physics and the nature of warfare itself. The space around the human fleet was filled with debris, but it wasn't human debris. The twisted remains of Devourer bioships floated in massive clouds, some still twitching as their biological components died slowly in the vacuum of space. Zadar had seen Devourer wrecks before, but never in these quantities. It looked as if someone had taken a Devourer fleet and fed it through a meat grinder. The human fleet itself looked like it had been through the same meat grinder. Ships held together with metal patches and emergency sealant drifted in loose formation, many missing entire sections of their hulls. One destroyer had a massive hole through its center, where a Devourer bioweapon had punched completely through the ship, but somehow the vessel was still operational, its remaining crew working around the damage, as if having a hole in their ship was merely an inconvenience. "How are those ships still fighting?" Zadar asked, staring at vessels that should have been abandoned derelicts. Lisa checked her instruments, her fingers dancing over controls with the automatic precision of someone who had done this countless times before. "Humans are good at making broken things work," she said. "We've had a lot of practice." They received docking permission from the human flagship, a heavy cruiser called the UES Defiance. As their small ship approached, Zadar could see that the Defiance's hull was covered in scorch marks and what looked like bite marks from Devourer bioweapons. The ship was clearly held together more by willpower than structural integrity, but it was still fighting. The docking bay was chaos. Human crew members ran back and forth, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and body bags. Everyone was moving too fast, talking too loud, and working too hard, as if they were trying to accomplish several days' worth of tasks in a single hour. The air was filled with the sounds of machinery, shouted orders, and something that might have been singing if it hadn't been so desperate. Captain Steve Murphy met them at the airlock. His uniform was stained with blood, oil, and something green that Czar didn't want to identify. Murphy's eyes were bloodshot and his hands shook slightly, but he was grinning with the expression of someone who had just won a lottery he hadn't expected to survive. "Commander Zdar, right?" Murphy said, shaking his hand with enough enthusiasm to rattle Zdar's bones. "Great timing. We just finished our third major engagement. Lost the Henderson and the Carlisle, but we took down one of their big boys. Thing was the size of a space station." Zdar looked around the docking bay, trying to process what he was seeing. Half the crew looked like they should be in medical facilities. Many had bandages soaked with blood, burns that were still smoking, or mechanical prosthetics that had been hastily attached to replace missing limbs. None of them seemed to care about their injuries. They just kept working, driven by some internal engine that wouldn't let them stop. "Captain Murphy," Zdar said carefully, "how long have your forces been in continuous combat?" Murphy paused in his enthusiastic handshaking and actually thought about the question for a moment. "What day is it?" he asked. "Honestly, we've been fighting for about 72 hours straight, maybe more. Time gets weird out here when you're having fun. 72 hours of continuous combat would drive most species insane. Zdar had never heard of military forces maintaining combat effectiveness for more than 12 hours without rest, and even that was considered the absolute limit of endurance. The humans had been fighting for 3 times that long and showed no signs of stopping. "Your crew needs medical attention and sleep," Zdar said, though he could see that his words were falling on deaf ears. Murphy laughed with genuine amusement. "Yeah, probably. But the bugs don't sleep, so neither do we. Come on, Let me show you around. As they walked through the ship's corridors, Zdar was amazed by what he saw. Human crew members were singing while they worked on critical repairs. Others were telling jokes while welding hull breaches. One group was playing cards next to a massive hole in the ship's hull, apparently unconcerned that only an emergency force field stood between them and the vacuum of space. In the medical bay, Dr. Amy Foster was treating a steady stream of wounded humans with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this far longer than should have been humanly possible. Zdar noticed that she was operating with one arm in a sling, her left hand doing the work of two, while her right arm hung useless at her side. "Dr. Foster," Zdar said, "you appear to be injured yourself." She looked up from the soldier she was treating, her eyes focusing on Zathar with the kind of exhausted attention that came from too much work and too little sleep. "Took some shrapnel yesterday," she said, as if discussing the weather. "No big deal. We've lost about 30% of our people in the last 3 days, so everyone who can work is working." She said this with the same tone she might use to comment on an interesting patient, as if 30% casualties were a normal part of medical practice. Zathar realized that 30% casualties would be considered a devastating defeat by any military force he knew. The humans seemed to consider it a normal day at the office. "Doctor, how do your people maintain morale with such losses?" Zathar asked. Amy smiled and returned to her patient, her hands working with the kind of practiced skill that comes from treating too many wounded people in too short a time. "Morale?" she said. "We're winning, aren't we? Every ship we destroy is one less ship threatening Earth. Simple math." But it wasn't simple math. Zathar had reviewed the tactical data. The humans were outnumbered 10-1. Their ships were inferior to coalition vessels, which were already outclassed by Devourer bioships. Their weapons were outdated, their armor was inadequate, and their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. By every logical calculation, they should have been wiped out in the first engagement. Captain Murphy led him to the bridge, where Zathar saw something that would stay with him forever. The main screen showed footage from their most recent battle, recorded by automated systems that had somehow survived the engagement. A human destroyer, heavily damaged and losing atmosphere through dozens of hull breaches, was accelerating directly in the ship's mess hall. Czar met Private Danny Rodriguez, the brother of the captain who had died ramming the Devourer's ship. Danny was eating with his left hand because his right arm was missing from the elbow down. The stump was wrapped in bandages that were already soaked with blood, but he seemed more interested in his meal than in his injury. "Private Rodriguez," Czar said carefully, "you should be in medical care." Danny looked up and grinned with the kind of cheerful expression that belonged on a vacation brochure rather than a battlefield. "Doc Foster says I can keep the arm if I want, but the prosthetic works better for operating weapon systems. Besides, my brother always said I was too right-handed anyway." The casual way Danny talked about losing a limb disturbed Czar more than anything else he had seen. When he suggested that Danny should be evacuated to a medical facility, the young human laughed as if the idea was genuinely amusing. "Evacuated? We're just getting warmed up out here. The bugs think they can scare us with their bioweapons and their size advantage. They don't understand humans very well." "What don't they understand?" Czar asked. Danny's expression became thoughtful, and for a moment he looked older than his years. "They think war is about survival," he said. "For humans, war is about making sure the right side wins. Those are two very different things." That night, Czar remained aboard the Defiance as the human fleet prepared for another engagement. He watched from the bridge as Captain Murphy gave orders to his crew, amazed by the way the humans moved with manic energy while preparing weapons and checking systems. They were singing songs that seemed to be about death and glory, turning the preparation for battle into something that resembled a celebration more than a military operation. When the Devourer fleet appeared on their sensors, the human crew actually cheered. Czar had seen many species react to overwhelming enemy forces during his decades of service. He had never seen anyone react with joy. "All ships, this is Murphy," the captain announced over the communication system. His voice carried across the bridge with the kind of confidence that should have been impossible under the circumstances. "Looks like we've got about 50 of the ugly bastards incoming. Remember, we don't have to kill all of them, we just have to make sure they regret meeting us." The battle that followed was unlike anything in Czar's experience. Humans fought with a combination of tactical skill and absolute recklessness that defied every principle of military science he had learned. They used their ships as weapons, their bodies as shields, and their lives as currency to buy victory. When it was over, 12 human ships had been destroyed, but 27 Devourer vessels were floating dead in space. The mathematics still didn't make sense, but the results were undeniable. Somehow, the humans had achieved a 2-to-1 kill ratio against an enemy that should have been destroying them without significant losses. As Zdar prepared to return to Forward Base Delta 7, Captain Murphy shook his hand one final time. "Thanks for visiting, Commander," Murphy said. "Hope we didn't scare you too much." Zdar looked at the young human captain whose species had just accomplished the impossible while treating it as routine. "Captain Murphy," Zdar said quietly, "I believe I am beginning to understand why the Devourers should be afraid." Instead of returning to Forward Base Delta 7, Zdar made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He requested permission to remain embedded with human forces as a coalition observer. General Krixt was not pleased, but he approved the assignment after Zdar explained that someone needed to document human tactics for coalition records. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. Zdar needed to understand what he was witnessing. In 30 years of warfare, he had never seen anything like human military doctrine. It violated every principle he had learned about combat, logistics, and basic survival. Yet it was achieving results that established military theory said were impossible. Over the following weeks, Zdar watched humans fight in ways that challenged his understanding of warfare itself. They advanced when tactical doctrine called for retreat. They attacked when common sense demanded defense. They spent lives like currency, always buying something more valuable than what they paid. The first revelation came during what humans called a boarding action. Sergeant Kate Johnson led a team of 12 Marines onto a Devourer bioship, a living vessel the size of a small city. Zdar had read about Devourer bioships in coalition intelligence reports, but seeing one through the helmet cameras of the boarding team was a different experience entirely. The ship's interior was designed to kill intruders through psychological terror, as much as physical weapons. Zdar watched through the Marines' helmet cameras as Kate's team moved through corridors that pulsed like blood vessels. The walls secreted acid that could dissolve most metals in seconds. The air was filled with spores that caused hallucinations and respiratory failure in most species. Creatures that looked like walking nightmares hunted them through the darkness, their bioluminescent markings creating patterns that were specifically designed to trigger fear responses in sentient minds. The Marines were laughing. "Johnson, you seeing these ugly things?" came a voice over the radio. That was Corporal Bill Hayes, one of Kate's veterans. The team continued deeper into the ship. making jokes about the horrors around them as if they were tourists commenting on interesting local wildlife. When Private Lucy Torres lost her helmet to a creature's claws, she kept fighting while breathing the toxic air that should have killed her within minutes. When Corporal Hayes ran out of ammunition, he started using a broken piece of the ship's wall as a club, commenting on how much better it felt than the regulation weapons. "Sergeant Johnson," Za said over the communication channel, "your team needs to retreat. The environmental hazards alone should be fatal." Kate's response came between bursts of weapons fire. "Commander, we've got a job to do here. These charges aren't going to plant themselves." The mission was simple in concept, but insane in execution. Kate's team was placing explosive charges throughout the bioship's vital organs, following a plan that would destroy the vessel from the inside. The problem was that doing so would kill everyone on the boarding team. There was no extraction plan because extraction was impossible. "Sergeant, there is no extraction plan for your team," Za pointed out, though he suspected she already knew. "I know," Kate said cheerfully, as if discussing weekend plans. "That's what makes it interesting." Jia watched 12 humans work their way through a living nightmare, placing charges that would kill them along with their target. They did this while singing songs about home, telling stories about people they loved, and making plans they would never live to complete. When the charges detonated, the bioship died in convulsions that could be seen from space. Kate Johnson and her team died with it. Their final transmission was Kate singing something called "My Country 'Tis of Thee," while the ship's death throes shook her to pieces. Her voice carried over the communication channel until the very last moment, clear and strong and completely unafraid. The tactical result was significant. The bioship had been coordinating devourer forces across 3 star systems. Its destruction threw enemy operations into chaos for weeks, allowing coalition forces to achieve their first major victories in months. But Za couldn't understand why 12 people had volunteered to die for it. "Because someone had to," explained Colonel Frank Davis when Za asked. Davis was the human ground forces commander, a man whose hair had gone white during just 2 months of fighting devourers. They were standing in what had been a human forward outpost called Firebase Delta. Now it was a crater, surrounded by the remains of thousands of devourer creatures.